Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 4 of the Retail Institute's annual briefing conference. It's been a real pleasure to see this week so many excellent speakers sharing their insights on businesses, their strategies and approaches to sustainable challenges that are facing us all. Today will be no different. Before I introduce today's presenters and conclude the series of webinars for this week, I would like to just reflect on the event so far. Firstly, I wanted to thank you, the audience, for making this event a success. We have been really impressed with the numbers of our members and guests who have been listening to the sessions and sending us kind words about the content and format. I think this means that this virtual experiment works and that hosting events online is a preferable format that we will take forward. It's been wonderful to see so many questions after each of the sessions. I think that's been unprecedented. I'm a strong believer that there is something unique in meeting people in person and getting to know them. And I always see it as a privilege of my role. And I always felt that the virtual reality deprives us of that chance. Whilst networking with each other is still not replicable in this setting, I think those interactive Q&A sessions are richer, fuller in context. So thank you so much for being such a good and proactive audience. It's really rewarding to see you engage with us and for our presenters to see that you appreciate the interaction with them. Secondly, some of you know that we are looking at how to make membership more valuable to you by introducing more different online activities. Some of you give us some great ideas in what you would like to see in the new program, more digitally revolutionized Retail Institute membership. And this year, we will have some future concept shared with you. Lastly, I would like to mention our collaborative industry group report on the future of packaging. We have released the publication this week to the members of the group on Tuesday, and we'll be making it available today to everybody who attended the conference and wider industry. Once again, I just want to encourage everybody to familiarize yourself with that document. It's quite lengthy, but particularly with the recommendations and the statement from the group at the very end, because we believe this is the right approach to pursue for the future of the sustainable future of the retail industries. It was really good yesterday to hear Barry Turner and Manjula speak about so many of the issues that we identified as important to move the conversation on sustainability forward. Now, just a quick reminder on some of the house rules, and there's of course a bit less than before. The webinars are also recorded, so if you cannot stay for the whole morning, we will send you a link to the session next week. You can watch those sessions at your leisure. Please forgive me, somebody decided that this is a really good time to try my phone, my landline, and yes, I still got one of these, I'm afraid. We started today at 10 a.m. and we will finish around 12:45. At question and answer sessions, we invite you to submit your questions through the Slido platform, which hopefully you'll be familiar with now. So you either type in Slido in your search browser, or you can use the link we'll give you, and then you will just need to put the hashtag code to access the question panel each day. Now, you have the hashtag code, I believe, displayed on your screens, but it just follows the same format as earlier in the week, which is hashtag RI Briefing FRI for Friday. So hashtag RI Briefing FRI. If you would like to connect with any of the presenters after the session, please let us know. Now, today we are concluding a series of webinars on a high note with some fantastic contributors that we've got here today. Our academic colleague, Dr. Audra Diaz-Lawson, is a global leader in crisis research. Who better than Audra to share her time with us today and comment on this unprecedented challenge that businesses have been facing during the pandemic. She's a fantastic speaker, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing her today. Dr. Bernd Brandt, who recently joined our colleagues from Excellent University of Applied Sciences in Vienna, he's going to be joining us today to speak about optimization of packaging that contributes to elimination of food waste. Bernd has a very succinct and factual style, and I know he's gathered a lot of positive comments last year. Our last speaker of today is an academic colleague who many of you know and value, and some of you rely on his expertise. He's a true fountain of knowledge when it comes to the type of environmental and material challenges we've been discussing throughout the conference. Ahead of us in the landscape that is outlined in the Paris Agreement, perhaps the biggest challenge of all, ceasing our reliance on fossil fuels, a critical subject when it comes to plastic packaging. So Neil's presentation will talk about the future of bioplastic and some important considerations for the scale of that task. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Audra Diaz-Lawson. In her career of more than 20 years, Dr. Diaz-Lawson has been a practitioner, researcher, and instructor in strategic communication with an emphasis on crisis response and brand management. As the editor for the flagship journal on crisis communication, the Journal of International Crisis and Risk Communication Research, and chair for the Crisis Communication Division of the European Communication, Research and Education Association, Dr. Diaz-Lawson is recognized as a global leader in crisis research. Her recently released book, Crisis Communication, Managing Stakeholder Relationship, is the first comprehensive text on crisis communication and provides background for academics and practitioners alike. Dr. Diaz-Lawson has worked across industries like IT, health, agriculture, and the public sector in multinational, national, regional, and local contexts. Audra, you're welcome to start your presentation.
Good morning, and I would like to thank Olga and the Retail Institute for inviting me. You know, retail has been on notice, though, for a number of years about changing consumer habits with some well-documented high street chain struggles. But 2020 has certainly taught us a lot of hard lessons about business strategy across many sectors. Hopefully one of those lessons, though, is in the importance of contingency planning. Next. I grew up in a very niche industry where my parents and I built our photography and integrated marketing communications business into one of the top 10 in the US within the equine industry. But our clients ranged from horse breeders to retail outlets serving the industry. Next, please. For higher education, I did what I like to call a tour of state universities, beginning with my bachelor's in speech communication from Colorado State University, and then a master's in communication and mass media from the University of Wyoming, and then finally my PhD in organizational communication, working with some of the leading scholars in my field. Next, please. But along the way, I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of organizations and businesses being part of a post-crisis change initiative with Applied Materials Shared Services Division, working alongside a senior global vice president at MasterCard Global on crisis leadership, and working on projects to improve internal and external communication for organizations like the NHS or the European Public Employment Services. Next, please. From a research perspective, my work focuses on the connections between organizations, next slide please, their stakeholders, and issues that affect both of them. Primarily, my research focuses on risk and crisis communication management, but going beyond that to sustainability issues as well. From an international leadership perspective, as Olga mentioned, I'm the editor of the only dedicated risk and crisis communication journal, and being the chair of the European Crisis Communication Division gives me the opportunity to really work with a lot of scholars and practitioners across Europe and certainly across the world. So I collaborate with practitioners and academic researchers representing universities from Europe, Asia, North America, Australasia, and also organizations like the World Health Organization. Next, please. In my world, prevention is critical to mitigate the risk posed to organizations by crises. Yet, as I mentioned, retail has been on notice for a number of years about the changing consumer habits with the well-documented high street chain struggles. So this presentation's central premise is that investment in planning, early detection, and building crisis capacity not only saves jobs and manages economic uncertainty, but can also provide long-lasting return on investment. To support that premise, I'll focus on two key propositions. First is outlining the acknowledgement that while 2020 has been hard on retail, the warning signs have been clear for several years. And second, that with proactive steps, the industry can future-proof against ongoing dangers or crises, producing serious changes in the industry. So next, please. Let's start with an overview of the impact of the internet on retail in the UK. From 2015 to 2020, the percent of the population that has been active internet users here in the UK has risen from 89% to 96%, meaning that almost everyone in the UK can be classed as an active internet user. Then when we add in social media and social media engagement, that has risen from 59% of the population in 2015 to 66% in 2020. So when we talk about the UK, we're talking about one of the most connected populations on the planet, with only about 4 out of every 100 people who are not active internet users. Next, please. The ways that people also are shopping is fundamentally changing and has been. In 2016, for example, 79% of internet users were researching products or browsing stores online. Yet today, those numbers are substantially higher, with 86% researching products or services online and 90% visiting retail stores online. This is keeping in mind there's only about 4% of Brits who aren't online at all. Next, please. But the question is, how does this translate into purchases? So as we can see, the conversion of browsing online to making a purchase is pretty high, with about 81% of folks making some kind of online purchase in 2020. But more than that, when we look at the numbers for online purchasing behavior, we're talking about a growth in the last 6 years alone, from 64% to 81% in e-commerce. But it's also important to note the growth of m-commerce, or people buying stuff on their phone. This has more than doubled in the last 6 years alone, with nearly 40% of active internet users buying something from their phone. Now keep in mind, all of this data was pre-COVID. We Are Social's report issued each January is based on the previous year's trends, so I'm sure we've already seen the reports that online shopping has only increased during COVID because we haven't had anything else to do. We've been in our houses, so we couldn't get to the shops. But what these figures all tell me is that retailers who weren't already making significant changes in their business models to emphasize online commerce may have already been behind. All the indicators that have been there for years, with the evidence just showing the last 5 years of sustained online retail growth. Uniquely, the UK has long been ahead of the curve, spending substantially more than almost every other country in the world with online shopping. So UK retailers have had a lot of preparation time, but are also the most well-positioned to show a really good growth. Next, please. In a report from early this year, Deloitte summarized the critical changes facing retail in 2020, and this was even before the pandemic. They identified 3 broad categories of change based on consumer preferences and ethics. The changes that Deloitte identified also happen to coincide with most of the academic research that I've seen for the last 5 years about changes in consumption, consumer attitudes, and generally social responsibility. So let's take a look at these. First, they identified a sustainability paradigm shift. And I'm sure this is something that we've been talking about all week. So as we know, especially in fashion, for example, we have had a lot of retail contribution to global carbon emissions, even greater than the airline industry. So critiques of the airline industry that have been made very visible in 2019 should be a warning shot about what's coming in terms of consumer attitudes. It's both an ethical obligation as well as a meaningful business opportunity. So Deloitte argued that those retailers who are able to prioritize sustainability are going to be the most survivable ones over the next 5 to 10 years. But why has this come about? They identified 2 critical changes. First is what they called a growth of the circular economy, which means that consumers are just more mindful of what happens to products when they're finished using them. And second, increasingly transparent supply chains. Consumers want to know how the materials for their products are sourced and that they're sourced in an ethical way. So retailers need to make their supply chains much more apparent. Second, Deloitte argues that there's an expectation for a reinvention of retail. And they point out that more than ever, consumers demand a unique experience, both in store and online. So what this may look like may vary, but it boils down to consumers wanting an emotional connection to their shopping experience. They want their shopping experience to feel good. For example, in a piece of research that I've done on reduced price shopping in the grocery industry, one of the inhibitors for lower income people was the feeling that they had no choice in their food consumption because they were on a strict budget. It makes them feel bad about themselves and resent the options that they have. So retailers like Aldi are gaining in part because they're making inexpensive brands feel good and creating a positive shopping experience for them. But for retailers more generally, what does this mean? Deloitte argues that there are three implications. First is the growth of marketplaces. So there's just a proliferation of choice, meaning that retailers have to offer something unique. Second, new digital experiences mean that the digital environment is playing an increasingly important and creative role in the customer experience. The creation of brand communities, for example, has emerged as vital to the health and the reputation of brands. And third, changes in technological capabilities means that it's easier to support the growth and connective space of immersive experiences. The final component is authenticity in the new digital space, and they argue that this is critical. So the connection between brands and the consumer values is becoming more and more important. So an organization, a company, being a good member of their community is simply an expectation of doing business with today's brands. But this doesn't suggest that old CSR, corporate social responsibility models are viable. Deloitte points out that there are two changes in customer attitudes driving this. First is the conscious consumption. This goes beyond the sustainability trend that I've already talked about, but extends into a social, ethical, and community purpose that's vital for retailers. Second, inclusion is business opportunity. Rather than highlighting a brand's exclusivity, highlighting its accessibility is vital. So to keep up with good consumer expectations, retailers have to be meeting them. Good retailers have been doing this to some degree. However, Brexit and COVID are accelerating the need for this. So I want to introduce the rest of the presentation a couple of tools that retailers can use to build more authentic retail reputations, identify threats and opportunities, and build greater crisis capacity. Next slide. So I want to start with what I mean by crisis capacity. Why start here? Because it's crises that we want to mitigate or avoid when we're talking about future-proofing retail. It's a truism that crises will happen, but not every potential crisis needs to occur, and those that cannot be avoided need to be suppressed in terms of their negative impact. There have been a number of studies suggesting that if organizations adopt stakeholder models of corporate governance, it improves their ability to be more proactive and accommodating in crisis management. The implication of this is when corporate governance itself focuses on the needs of stakeholders, it affects everything else in the organization, from contract development to management behaviors. So when I talk about crisis capacity building, I'm talking about an overall framework for decision making that's focused on balancing stakeholder needs and is described as an integrated management approach for organizational decision making, involving prevention, mitigation, actual response and recovery, and explicitly includes advisory panels, internal and external communications personnel, and functional management teams linking normal operations with crisis response. So it suggests that as a crisis emerges, instead of assembling a crisis response team, that team is already in place and has been working together across routine activities as well as risk mitigation and crisis management activities. Next slide. There are several benefits for organizations whose management structures facilitate this kind of ongoing decision, risk mitigation, and stakeholder-centered strategy. First, the obvious one, the risk mitigation activities, for example, issues management, minimizes or eliminates crises before they emerge and improves crisis response. Second, this kind of integrated management improves organizational learning and is especially beneficial for small and medium-sized organizations who are oftentimes the least able to weather crises. Third, these structures improve the purposeful exchange of information within and between organizations, the media, and other stakeholders before and after crises. Fourth, it can help to improve the conditions and the coordination of crisis management between often competing interests within organizations. See, there's often a disconnect between communication recommendations for responding to issues as well as the legal recommendations for response. When the organization's decision-making process is set up to facilitate coordination between departments and interests within the organization, competing and contradictory recommendations can be minimized, and so this improves the material response as well as the reputational outcomes. So in short, when an organization's structure and management approach integrates issues and crisis response as routine, it provides a source of sustainable, competitive advantage that allows organizations to move from being crisis prone to crisis prepared. But more than that, this kind of an integrated management approach not only builds the capacity of the organization to respond to crises, but perform more ethically before, during, and after. But this is the big picture. How do we connect all the retail trends? Well, I want to start with the first tool to connect crisis capacity, reputation, and what Deloitte was talking about in terms of building a reinvented, sustainable, and authentic retail for 2020, building more authentic social responsibility initiatives. Now, I want to be really clear here. When I'm talking about social responsibility, I'm not talking about traditional models for corporate social responsibility. I'm talking about creating a modern sense of authentic and ethical organizations, something that Deloitte highlighted and that in a post-COVID environment is vital. All too often, CSR initiatives feel like we're just putting lipstick on a pig. Next slide. And next slide. Research and practice for traditional approaches to CSR yields a pretty mixed bag. Some studies point to a lot of positive outcomes for organizations that engage in CSR and use their CSR initiatives as a point of promotion for the organization. So on the positive side, we see findings suggesting that companies who are socially responsible often have improved brand loyalty, attract better employees, reduce their risks when crises emerge. So in some cases, social responsibility schemes actually function to manage risks to prevent crises from emerging. But they also promote identification between the consumer and the companies. People want to patronize companies that they see as sharing their values and their concerns. And finally, CSR can improve an organization's trustworthiness and its reputation. Yet there's a lot of research where the story is less positive and the inconsistent findings showing a difficulty in proving the specific ROI on the resources, time, personnel, and money spent on CSR programs. It can even, as some findings have shown, build higher expectations for the organizations to perform well. So if an organization commits a transgression, stakeholders can feel betrayed. So, for example, this was the case with the Volkswagen, the emissions scandal. Third, we're living in an era too where people are more cynical about the authenticity of CSR. People often view CSR as some kind of shameless effort to curry favor. And finally, greenwashing, or specifically the references to pro-environmental activities that organizations claim can seem less than sincere. Next slide. So how can we meet consumers' expectations for socially responsible, engaged, and sustainable retail in 2020? Well, in the last few years, I've done some research, including focus groups and surveys with consumers trying to figure out this problem, these inconsistencies in social responsibility. And what I've found is that broadly, we can use a hygiene metaphor for social responsibility. Good hygiene makes us tolerable to be around, but it doesn't make us a good person. So if we think about this in the context of sustainability and social responsibility objectives, if people believe that a company is a good company, then socially responsible activities increase their satisfaction with the organization and makes them more likely to engage and buy products and services from the company. Next slide. If, however, people don't believe that the company is a good company, then the sustainability and the social responsibility initiatives might just seem like window dressing that just doesn't matter. Next slide. And here's the way to build a better received social responsibility or sustainability agenda within retail organizations. And this is based on the research that I've done with the consumers. If an organization wants its CSR initiatives to be viewed as authentic and thus be viewed as more effective, then very simply, they need to show consumers that the consumer matters and that the consumer's choice to support socially responsible organizations matters. Second, they need to demonstrate that CSR is actually making a difference in the communities where the consumers live, not halfway around the world. Third, to be viewed as authentic, the organization needs to have a good reputation. So here's the sticky wicket for building crisis capacity. CSR needs to seem authentic, but it also needs to be a part of how the organization does its business on a regular basis. So when we're talking about building good crisis capacity, being socially responsible demonstrates a company is motivated to do good. When it comes to a crisis context, so long as the company isn't facing a transgression or where they've done something wrong time and time again, then being socially responsible is an effective way to minimize or mitigate the brand damage and all of the negative outcomes that come with crises. But this isn't the whole story, and there's more that's telling when it comes to CSR. Next slide. It turns out that when it comes to stakeholders making judgments about organizations that are just trying to make themselves look good or a hygiene conclusion, these judgments are formed by, first, the consumer's belief that whether or not they spend money with the organization isn't really going to make the organization decide anything different. That they're so big that even if I don't buy from them, it's just not going to matter. Second, for CSR to matter, the impact needs to be local. If we combine the first 2 points, people seem like they want to feel like their choices have a positive impact. So if they spend with a company that does good in their own communities, they feel like they're getting something out of the consumption that they can feel good about. Third, having a bad reputation means that socially responsible actions aren't necessarily or probably not going to lead to positive outcomes, at least in the short run. But it's important to note that there isn't a negative outcome associated with this. It's just that the CSR fails to be effective. So for organizations that have gone through a crisis that damaged their reputation, this means they may not be able to rely on the social responsibility programs to bail them out for a quick reputation fix. However, this doesn't mean that socially responsible action isn't going to help them rebuild the trust and their reputation in the long term. Reputation is a long-term judgment, and people want constant evidence of the company's good work. So this can still be an effective part of a crisis reputation recovery strategy. It's just that the benefits are long-term. And finally, promoting the company for sales and marketing purposes on the basis of being socially responsible is just not persuasive. In this way, the data suggests that it's positioning CSR work alongside the specific action to make a purchase is really quite ineffective. Talking up a company's engagement in the community is desirable, but it just seems like it cannot be the method to get to the sale. So to be able to design a more authentic consumer experience means that modern demands for sustainability, engagement, and immersion should provide retailers with a template for evaluating what they need to do in order to use social responsibility to meet today's consumer expectations. Next slide. But when we're talking about retail and the retail stakeholder environment, modern retailers face complex and challenging stakeholder environments with often diverse and competing internal and external interests at multiple layers. As all of the indicators suggest, success for modern retailers relies on anticipating stakeholders' interests and needs. So what's needed is a research-based process that allows an organization to understand its stakeholders and the stakes at any given time, yet one that's still flexible enough to account for changes in stakeholders as well as their reputation with the their relationship with the organizational environment. So stakeholder mapping is a way to begin this process. If we map the stakeholders or those groups with an interest in an organization's actions, we can better understand the complexity of a particular organization's environment, as well as the risks posed by that environment and changes within it. Next, please. So to begin the mapping process, an organization should list all the stakeholders that it knows about, or at least start with the priority ones. This means due diligence in trying to identify as many stakeholders that the organization regularly deals with and not so regularly deals with. But before we can place the stakeholder in relation to the organization, we need to know a few more pieces of information. We need to understand the power, legitimacy, relational history, relational valence, and urgency of their interests. So let's walk through these one at a time. Next slide. Not surprisingly, one of the first factors that ought to be considered is in mapping a stakeholder is power. Now, there are a lot of ways to think about power, from mutual respect to a more Machiavellian notion of forcing someone to do something they wouldn't ordinarily do. But most of the research in power in organizational contexts focuses on whether the stakeholders have direct influence over the organization's actions. So the ways to consider this is power in this context is to think about the direct imposition of the stakeholder will on the organization. So the direct imposition of stakeholders' will can come through a number of mechanisms such as regulatory compliance, consumer activism like boycotts, but it also can be a means of negotiation. For example, when opening stores in Southeast Asia, IKEA petitioned the governments for improved infrastructure, living wages for anyone connected to the improvements, and IKEA, not just their own employees, and a few other points related to sustainability and employee conditions. Because of the financial benefits of IKEA's presence in these regions, the authorities agreed to IKEA's requests. So this is an example of IKEA as a stakeholder to the governments directly imposing their will. Second, stakeholders can impose their will through utilitarian or practical means. So that's to say that the stakeholders can influence organizations because it's mutually beneficial if the organization meets stakeholder requests. This is the case with the Barcelona Football Club in their partnership with UNICEF. Barcelona provides UNICEF with financial support, and by placing UNICEF's name on their jersey with players like Lionel Messi being spokespersons for the charity, the club demonstrated their goodwill and their social responsibility. Both win. However, being in that relationship can also mean that the organizations are able to influence one another because they're joined by mutual interest and mutual benefit. Next slide. Second, legitimacy should be thought of as an organization's recognition that the stakeholder group has a viable interest in the operations of the organization and its actions. Now, legitimacy does not mean that the organization has to like the stakeholder, rather that they just acknowledge that there is an interest that the stakeholder has in the organization, its actions, and that its advocacy is fair and valid. Of course, the social and the cultural values that ground in a retailer will influence whether or not stakeholder claims are viewed as legitimate or not. For example, in Nordic countries, or Germany, for example, where labor unions often collaborate with companies, the interest of the unions in the way that the organization treats its employees is likely to be viewed as legitimate. So an organization's ethics and its values will provide guidance in how it can interpret particular stakeholder interests in its operations. Next slide. Relationship history simply asks whether or not an organization directly knows its stakeholder. Those stakeholders who are known to an organization in this context are those with whom the organization has had direct dealings and interactions, like their employees, primary consumers, business partners, known regulators, and so on. But in many cases, organizations may be aware that stakeholders exist but have no previous dealings with them. And in other cases, stakeholders may have an interest in a retailer, but the retailer is completely unaware of their existence. So it is certainly in an organization's best interest to be as aware of as many stakeholders as possible. That means that they're able to be better stewards of stakeholder interests. But so in an organizational environment, and not just in social media, there will be people, groups, and organizations that all have a connection to the retailer, but have never made themselves specifically known. Yet these different groups can be triggered by events. And so that's why relational history is more than just whether a stakeholder is known, but whether an organization has a specific relationship with them or not. Next slide. Organizations also have stakeholders that they like and that they dislike, our friends and our foes. So this is where we come back to the distinction that I made earlier with regards to legitimacy. We can recognize a stakeholder's interest as being appropriate based on our organization's mission, but that doesn't mean that we necessarily like them. So relational valence focuses on the degree to which an organization actually likes the stakeholder and would prefer to do business with it. But there is an adage that we keep our friends close and our enemies closer, and that's often applied in managing stakeholder relationships. For example, because we know that one of the critical issues in retail is sustainability, it's certainly within a retailer's best interest to build strategic relationships with environmental advocates in order to gain support, intelligence, and potentially reduce criticism of the company's activities by developing and maintaining good relationships. So relational valence tells us who an organization's most favored stakeholders are, but not necessarily the stakeholders that they'll interact with most. Therein is the key distinction between the legitimacy and valence. Both are important to know, but there's different ways that the organization and the retailer will deal with stakeholders depending on whether they like them or not. And then finally, next slide. Not all stakeholder interests are certainly equal, and they're not going to be given all time by any organization. So one of the principal differences is an organization's motivation to manage particular stakeholder interests. That's governed by the timeliness or the urgency of the stakeholder's need. So one of the challenges that retailers face leading up to Brexit is managing supply chains. So where supply chain partners are placed in relationship to active consumers will give an indication as to where attention and resource prioritization is going to take place for retailers. And so these are all the things that I know everyone juggles all the time, but if you can start to map them, you get a bit more of an organized and strategic approach to it. So next slide. Based on this mapping exercise, 4 categories of stakeholders emerge. Along with this classification come some implications for stakeholder relationships and as well as issues and crisis management. So it's important to note that this process is meant to map a retailer's stakeholders at any given moment. It allows organizations to document and to track the relationships with critical stakeholders across time, but it's a series of snapshots. So the bottom line is that this isn't a one-off exercise, but it should be done periodically to yield better intelligence in terms of managing stakeholders and deciding who strategic partners might be, relationships to bolster, relationships to back away from. So let's take a look at these 4 categories. First are strategic stakeholders. Those are the ones with legitimacy, power, and a clear relational history with the organization. They may not necessarily be liked by the organization, but regardless of the positive or negative valence, these are stakeholders that an organization knows they have to work with in order to achieve their key objectives. Second, desirable stakeholders are those that the organization likes and believe have legitimate interest in the business, but may not have a direct relational history with. But they're also stakeholders who lack direct power over the organization. By identifying what desirable stakeholders care about and how the organization might be able to support those stakeholder interests in a way that's aligned with the organization's priorities and goals can create strategic opportunities for organizations like social responsibility programs and initiatives within communities. Third, moral stakeholders are then, by definition, those that an organization doesn't explicitly have a relationship with and whose concerns may not be viewed as legitimate, often just because the stakeholder themselves isn't clear and well defined. Broadly, we can think of these as the general public. So the moral stakeholder may not be relevant or even activated unless there is an issue or a crisis that emerges that they're connected with. So at this point, organizations may not be aware of them, but they may be aware of the organization. And then finally, stakeholders are often the most interesting group, because these are groups that have power but are not liked by the organization, nor their interests viewed by the organization as legitimate. But it's very possible that an organization may have to have relationships with them and may have a good, clear relationship history, whether it be positive or negative, with those groups that could affect or influence them. So even though they're a relationship that the organization may not want, they're a relationship that must be addressed. So in the end, the purpose of this tool for retail is to more purposefully consider the relationship between itself and its stakeholders. The visual map helps organizations to begin thinking about their connections and potential interrelationships between the stakeholders themselves. But the implications of the tool are twofold. First, to help the organization make more purposeful and strategic decisions about managing very complex organizational environments. And second, to help identify the stakes that connect the retailer with its public to have better anticipatory issue management. Head off issues before they become crises. Next slide. So 2020 has been a wake-up call for most business sectors, and with yesterday's announcement of the new package from the government, there's becoming more clarity on this. But retail is certainly not least among them. Retail's challenges, I think, have been largely downplayed in recent weeks, as we've been hearing so much about the hospitality industry. But for retail in 2020, the year has punctuated changes that have been coming. All the indicators, I would argue, that the survivability of particular retail outlets in the next decade isn't about lamenting the changes of high street. The high street model has been dying for years. All the digital and business indicators suggesting that retail must reinvent itself have been clear, but no more so in 2020. And so there are opportunities for retail to gain a competitive advantage that come from this reinvention. So I'm proposing that building crisis capacity not only allows the industry to guard against the next major crisis, but also by focusing on improving knowledge of its own stakeholders to create more authentic actions, retailers will be better positioned to meet the rapidly changing world that we're living in. So the tools that I've offered today, the recipe for authenticity and the stakeholder mapping tool, are two ways to meet not only the ethical and the moral obligations of modern organizations, but frankly, to build a more sustainable return on investment from being socially responsible and investing in a future-oriented management approach. Next slide. I'd like to thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Audra. I can see that we've actually got quite a few questions. So once we can see those, we'll just jump straight in there, because I think we may not have enough time. But if we don't, then we'll just ask you to perhaps answer those in the Q&A box on the right. So the first question for you, Audra, is how can an organization build a socially responsible image if promotion through traditional marketing and advertising channel is counterproductive?
That's a great question. What our research from talking with consumers suggests is that they want to be able to find it on their own. So they're quite happy for organizations to talk about all their socially responsible activities in social media, on the organizations or the retailer's webpage. I mean, keeping in mind that most people are going onto retailers' websites anyhow to look for information, having elements of that in there. So in terms of the social media side of it, there's, if you think about every 10 messages, 8 of them need to be something that is of value to the consumer and not actually a marketing or a sales message. That's the opportunity and that's the time for retailers to be talking about the work that they're doing. It's also a matter of engaging and building a good online brand community. So you let other folks talk about you. So if we think about the distinction between public relations and marketing functions, if CSR lies mostly in terms of the promotion and discussion of it in the public relations function and not the marketing function, it seems like it benefits the organization a whole lot more.
Thank you, Audra. We've got another great question. What are the significant differences required in between predictable and unpredictable risks? For example, 2008 financial crash compared to COVID.
So there really aren't any. It turns out from a consumer standpoint, well, let me caveat and back that up. The biggest one are repeated transgressions. So most stakeholders don't mind if an organization's done something wrong. They're quite pragmatic about it. The response is, every person makes a mistake. We would expect organizations to make mistakes. So the predictable ones are ones that have already happened to an organization or one within the industry, because industry gets lumped together. So within the, for example, in the sports footwear industry, Nike, for example, had a whole lot of organizations that came before it. At the time, it was about 8th retailer or shoe producer that when the sweatshop labor arguments were first being brought out to light and the realities of labor problems within that industry, they had a better response because they were able to actually clean up their factories ahead of time. So when we're talking about predictable and unpredictable, it's really a matter of whether the organization's done something wrong, or from a consumer standpoint or consumer's viewpoint, should have known better. That's the biggest difference. So predictable and unpredictable doesn't make a whole lot of difference. It's how they respond. You know, was the organization good to begin with? Have they responded fairly and justly to the people who have been affected? And so how can they weather the storm? That ends up being more, the material response later is the more important one.
Yes, good approach, good advice, and one perhaps that we should all consider for the future, because we don't know, you know, that we are facing different challenges apart from COVID that are heading away politically. So perhaps this is something worth keeping in mind.
Absolutely.
Now I've got another question. I don't know if it's finished, but let me just read it. What does consuming consciously really mean when consumption doesn't seem to slow?
That's a really good question. People are wanting to, they're still consuming. So there's, in the focus groups that we did, there are some fairly interesting responses about this notion of consuming consciously. People acknowledge if they are buying things from companies that may have a bad social responsibility record. So retailers that have been pointed out that their production and supply chains may rely on questionable labor, things like that. The pragmatic response is that they're still buying it because they want it, but they don't necessarily feel good about it. So the question is, the consuming consciously means that when they have a choice to buy something better, they will. Now, the other side of that is that they want to know that what happens to it afterwards. So the part of Deloitte's positioning and research found that they want to know what happens later. Is it recyclable? So if they buy something, if they have the opportunity between two products, one is more recyclable than the other, but they're both about the same cost point, they'll take the one that is more recyclable. So people are more aware. That may not change their behaviors in the short term, but in the long term, at the point that they have choices, it does.
Yes. Yes, that's something that actually we've been observing in the consumer behavior for quite some time now. Now, let me just jump to the next question. I'm just conscious that we've got a few more to get through. Where can I get training for my staff on crisis communications?
Well, we certainly at Leeds Beckett can provide that, but a lot of the time what it's about is trying to build up experiences. You know, one of the most frustrating things I think about crisis communication is trying to respond when no one has experience, and so everyone feels a bit awkward about it. But it's typically crisis training should be done by folks with good background in crisis communication, because it is more about a management strategy, and the responses then kind of make sense after you figure out the crisis side of it. So I would certainly invite a conversation beyond. I can offer some probably more tangible recommendations from that.
Thank you, Audra. Now, the next question is about what organizations would you consider leading on authentic CSR?
One of my favorite ones is Ben & Jerry's, because what they do from their supply chain all the way through the end of it, and this is before and after they have been taken over by or bought out by Unilever, is about trying to be as sustainable as possible. So they have worked with their producers, their packaging is recycled, and even when part of the agreement when the Ben & Jerry's sold to Unilever was that they retained an independent board of directors. So that's one. Patagonia is another one that gets typically high marks on that. Aldi is actually one that I would consider very, very good in terms of its CSR, and they do that from the way that they source, their efforts to try and be as energy neutral as possible. They're changing their packaging. So those are some examples that I think are pretty good.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Audra. Now, the last question that we have is, what is the main benefit of stakeholder mapping?
I would say not only two benefits. One is that you get to know your stakeholders better in terms of the relationship between, it's more of a purposeful consideration of the stakeholders, not just who do we do business with, but what is the relationship. And second, I think it's one of the best ways to do a bit of intelligence gathering for issues management. If you can understand what problems your stakeholders might have or what might frustrate them about you, then it's a lot easier to start heading off, to innovate, and to make some decisions ahead of time. The best crisis is the one that's averted. So it's the stakeholder mapping process is much more about prevention rather than anything else. So, I mean, certainly long-term managing stakeholder relationships is important, but I think it's about the intelligence and the critical thinking that goes into it.
I really like your point, Audra, and I think it's been it came across very strongly throughout your presentation, the point about always being ready and always kind of anticipating and having a strategy to deal with that before it occurs, whatever it is. Anyway, that's my kind of key takeout from your presentation, but I know it was packed with insights. Well, thank you so much, Audra. This has been hugely interesting, I'm sure, and thank you to the audience for submitting so many questions. I would like to invite now everybody to for a break, and the next presentation with Ben Brandt is at 11:10. So at 11:10 we will be commencing again. Now, thank you, Audra, and see you all after the break. Welcome back, everybody. After our break, I hope you had an opportunity to top up your coffee. I would like to now introduce our next speaker, Dr. Bernd Brandt from University of Applied Sciences in Vienna. Bernd Brandt holds a degree in Studies in Land and Water Management and Engineering from the University of Natural Resources and Applied Life Sciences in Vienna, Austria. He has more than 15 years of experience in the sustainability sector. His work focuses on sustainability assessment of products, and services in the total life cycle, including benefit stories of products, life cycle assessment, carbon footprint, cost-benefit analysis, as well as waste and resource management. He recently joined University of Vienna after having a career with Denkstadt, one of the most renowned sustainability consultancies in Central and Eastern Europe. Bernd, thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Olga, for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you today. As Olga already mentioned, I recently joined the University of Applied Sciences. Before, I was working for Denkstadt Sustainability Consulting, and within this work, I was part of a team working on a project called Stop Waste, Save Food. If we go to the next slide, please. Yes. This was a multi-stakeholder project where we assessed the influence of optimized processing and optimized packaging on food waste, and what is the effect on reduction and elimination of food waste. It was a 3 years project starting in October 2016. And was finally extended for some months, and final results then were presented in February 2020, just before the lockdown. We could present the results. If you go to the next slide, we'll see the consortium. It was a very huge consortium, including partners of the whole value chain. We had partners from producers, primary material producers. We had packaging producers, retailers, food producers. We had waste management organizations, also industrial organizations, and also the respective Austrian ministry was part of the consortium. Next slide, please. Before going into more details, some introductory words. So if you look at packaging ecology in the total life cycle, you have to take a look on all three main life cycle phases. So you have the production, where you can gain environmental benefits if you use, for example, eco-design, or if you look for increased material efficiency. Then we have the use phase. There it's important to look for the protection of goods, and then also how you can reduce waste, especially food waste. This is what I will talk to you later on. And also benefits of reuse are belonging to the use phase. And then we have finally the waste management phase, end of life, where we can gain environmental benefits due to recycling or energy recovery, or to cascade use. Next slide, please. Yes, the Quantis food report showed that almost 28% of the total carbon footprint, so the total global greenhouse gas emissions, are somehow related to food and food processing. Most of it is due to animal agriculture, and the reason for that is that the carbon footprint of producing meat is especially high. If you compare, you have about a carbon footprint of 0.2 to 2 kilograms CO2 equivalents per kilogram of produced food. If you look for example, vegetables, or if you look for bread or fruit. Compared to that, you have about, let's say, 5 to 10 kilograms CO2 equivalent per kilogram if you look for chicken or pork, for example. And even if you look for beef, then we have even 20 to 30 kilogram of CO2 equivalent. So this is quite a lot, and the effect of saving food waste is quite a huge one. So the potential is up to 5 or even 10% of the total carbon footprint could be reduced if we are able to eliminate these food wastes. And packaging is one issue which can help to do so. If we go on within the slide. we can see that exactly the packaging itself has only 3 to 3.5% of the carbon footprint, of the environmental impact of the total process. So most of it is the food and the distribution, and only a comparably very small percentage is related to the packaging. If you take the carbon footprint of a typical European consumer, which is about 15 tons of CO2 equivalents per year, we have only about 1.5 to 2% which are allocated to packaging. And if we just look at food packaging, it's only 0.7% of the total consumer carbon footprint of a European, which belongs to food packaging. Next slide, please. Yeah, we made some surveys within the studies and within the project, also on consumer perception of packaging. And interestingly, so people said, okay, packaging contributes to product security. So a lot of them say, yeah, about 70%, yes, this is correct. And also, are the important information carrier, also almost 70% contribute to my purchase decision. Packaging is important, also about, funnily, also about 70%. But if you move on the slide, when we ask if they help to reduce food waste or avoid food waste, about 2/3 said that they believe it does not apply, or it rather does not apply. And let's say this as a starting point of our presentation, of my presentation today, and what we discovered during our studies. Next slide, please. Yeah, we made several case studies within the project, some regarding meat packaging, where we compared different packaging solutions, also with fruit and vegetables. We made some surveys at consumer levels, also made some awareness raising, let's say, trainings, looked not only on the retailer level, but also on the consumer level, how food waste could be avoided. We made a case study on eggs, looking at a combination of fracture rate. So how is the food protection by the packaging compared to the material used. We made a case study on barrier design. We took coffee capsules and had a look how is it with the recyclability and versus protective function, and also the issue of avoiding overperformance. I will come to this also later on. And we had finally a transport case study where we looked on optimized conditions when cooled goods are transported. Next slide, please. Yeah, let's go into the details. Here we have the first example. These are mini cucumbers, which were examined, and we made some storage tests, checking the durability of these cucumbers, and then combined it with some plausible consumer scenarios. And we had actually three different scenarios. We compared unpackaged cucumbers with two packaged scenarios, and actually first one was a PP flow pack which was macro perforated. There we had a shelf life of 12 days, and at the end a waste rate of 4%. This was compared to a PP tray, also micro perforated, with a PET flow pack. That the shelf life was almost double, 23 days, and there was not a waste rate at all. So after 23 days, no waste. And we had the unpackaged version with a shelf life of 6 days and a waste rate of about 14%. The right side, you can see the results within the graph. So the the grams of CO2 equivalents are shown, which are generated for 250 grams of consumed mini cucumbers. And you can see for the two packed versions the impact of the packaging. In orange, you have the food waste, and you can see, which is very interesting, that the stored open scenario was in between. So the PP tray and PET scenario performed best. The carton tray PP flow pack version performed even worse without the food waste and adding the food waste. So it was even worse. So you can see the stored open, the version where it was unpackaged, was, as it was in between, you can say it is not possible, was the solution for us, or the conclusion for us, that you have no black and white. Sometimes it can be a better solution to have the food unpackaged. Sometimes it's better to have it packaged. We will see the later examples that most of the time the packaged solution is the one which is preferable. Next slide, please. Yeah, here we have the example of cooked ham, 3 different scenarios, 3 different packagings. We have 2 MAP, so modified atmosphere packaging trays. One was a PET PE tray with a PET PE film on it. This was compared to a PE laminated tray with PE laminated paper with a PET PE film on it. And finally, we compared it with a daily delicatessen paper from the counter with films in between, and all this was stored in a paper bag. And what the result shows that the MAP tray solutions performed better. Please move on to the next slide. Yeah, we can see that depending on the shelf life, which is shorter for the delicatessen paper solution, due to the shorter shelf life, so the carbon footprint got higher, because we have both at the retailer and also in the household, we have gained much more food waste, and this is the reason why the MAP solutions perform better. Here within the plastic paper solution performed slightly better than the other one, but both of them performed better, even funnily, even if we don't have any food waste within the household sector. And due to this one, also with, let's say, representative consumer behavior, we have even a higher difference to the MAP solutions. Please move on to the next slide. Yeah, here we compared portion packaging, for cream cheese, and we had a one portion packaging solution, and this was compared to a cup solution where we have a container, and here we have 2 consumer scenarios. One ended up in 3% food waste, the other one in 10% food waste, while the portion packaging showed no food waste at all. So after 18 days, you can see that almost half of the containers were discarded. The cups had to be discarded, while the portion packaging, there was no waste at all after this time. Next slide, please. Yeah, and sorry, can you go back once again? Thank you very much. Yeah, what does the example shows that also here the about double the carbon footprint of the packaging was about double for the portion packaging. So you have much more packaging, but this was outweighed by far by the advantage to have a very much reduced food loss. So especially if you have this 10% of food loss, it was almost 5 times higher the environmental impact, the climatic impact of the cup solution, although the packaging itself had a comparable small contribution to that. Next slide, please. Then we also had an example with egg packaging, as I said before, where we compared an rPET solution with one made of conventional carton. So this rPET was made of 100% of recycled PET bottles, and the results were mainly influenced by the fact that the carton solution is almost 1.5 times heavier than the plastic solution, and also it needs a lot of energy to take away the water. So it's very water consuming, the carton solution, and to get this water away you need a lot of energy, and this is also contributing to the carbon footprint. Go on, please. Yeah, this is this rPET egg packaging actually is a very good example for a circular plastic packaging, because it is made of 100% recyclate, as I've said. It's a transparent monomaterial. It's again 100% recyclable. It has a very high product protection, which was also included in the consideration in the calculation. Yeah, you have a very small material consumption, and apart from that, it's often a cheaper solution. On the right side, you can see the graph where you can see that about 20% is the difference between the rPET and the carton solution in terms of carbon footprint. And you can see that the raw material has a higher footprint for the rPET solution as well as the waste recovery, but this is outweighed by the high processing impact of the carton solution. And it was compared for a functional unit of 1,000 eggs, 10 eggs per packaging. Next slide, please. Yeah, here we have a comparison of meat packaging. We've compared the MAP tray versus vacuum skin packaging. So the conventional solution we had were these MAP trays made of PET with a PET PE film on top, and this was compared with this vacuum skin packaging with a PET base film and a PE top film with a barrier layer. And please go on. Yeah, the vacuum skin packaging increases the minimum shelf life from 6 to 7 days. This is what we had for MAP, to about 12 to 14 days. And during these tests we made at the retailers, we had almost 6% of waste for the MAP solution and only 3.7% for the vacuum skin packaging. Go on, please. Yeah. Again, now looking at the graph at the right side, for the functional unit of 400 grams of consumed beef, we have the comparison that we have 8% more CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions for the skin packaging solution, but this is by far outweighed by the reduced food losses, which could be saved, which all in all at the end gives a relationship of more than 40 if you compare the benefit of avoided food losses divided by the impact of this improved packaging solution. Next slide, please. Yeah, coffee. We made also a case study on coffee. Before going to the packaging itself, just some words regarding the share of impact between packaging, coffee, and machine and preparation. As you can see here in the graph, that packaging and the machine and preparation have about 20% of the climatic impact, and the coffee has more than half, has about 60%. So the coffee is by far the most important part of the game, which has the highest rucksack. And this is the reason, if we go on, that we can say that also coffee capsules can be useful compared, for example, to filter coffee, where very often, usually, a certain part of the coffee at the end is not consumed, but is thrown away. So this is not the case usually for coffee capsules. So this is the reason also, because coffee capsules can also perform better in comparison to maybe filter coffee. We within the study have focused on capsules and have compared several different options. We have looked at some made from aluminium, from polybutylene terephthalate, from polypropylene, and from polylactic acid. And for solution for polypropylene and PLA solution, we had differences in the barrier. So we had the barrier within the capsule itself. This was also for aluminium and PPT. So for all the 4 different materials, we had the solution of barrier within the capsule, and for PP and PLA, we also had the solution of an extra flow pack where the barrier was included. And the result for carbon footprint per coffee capsule showed that the PP capsule with an EVOH barrier within the capsule performed best. Regarding to the environmental effects we've investigated, so not only for carbon footprint, which is shown here as an example, but also for the others. And apart from that, we can also say that the barrier solution compared to the barrier in the flow pack performed also better. So lower impact regarding environment when you take the barrier within the capsule, then you put it in an extra flow pack. Next slide, please. Yeah, optimized packaging extends shelf life, and this helps to reduce the food waste. So this is one of the key findings. And what we also try to do is to find a correlation between the increase of shelf life and also the reduction of food waste. So this is something which cannot be generalized. It has to be looked at from point to point. So we have already now some results where we have looked this up into detail, and this is shown here in the diagram. And we can say for these first examples which are considered here, that if you double the shelf life, the minimum shelf life, you can say that the waste rate can be reduced about 40% within the retail sector. So we are looking for more examples to fill in the diagram with more dots, and to look if we can prove this more. But this was the first, let's say, the first conclusion, that we can say about 40% reduction within food waste by doubling the shelf life. Next slide, please. Yeah, optimized packaging helps. So on average, it helps to reduce food waste. So if you take typical impacts of fresh food here, you have an additional impact of, let's say here, 70 grams due to the optimized packaging. But on the other hand, you have reduced food waste, which lasts in 350 grams of CO2 equivalent. So you have on average a much higher portion of reduced food waste compared to the additional impacts which are coming from from the packaging, which normally has a higher impact when it is innovative, when it has a higher protective function. Next slide, please. Yeah, what we also try to do is to find a let's say sustainable design formula for circular, for a resource efficient economy. So this also takes parts out of all life cycle phases. So we have optimized material production, which is important. This in combination with a small material demand per functional unit. So this would be the optimal production process. Then this in combination with high functionality within the use phase, high quality, high functionality. This is most important. And together with optimum in recycling and recovery, so an optimum mix in recycling and energy recovery, which could be determined by cost-benefit analysis. And taking these things together, yeah, we can last in a low ecological, economic, and social impact. If we go on, yeah, it is outlined that priority here is on functionality. So this is the most important, that the packaging fulfills its function of protection, and this is most important for a low environmental impact. And then there are the issues of the raw material which is used, and also recycling aspects, which are important, but not as important as the high functionality of the packaging itself. Next slide, please. Yeah, what we've done is we've made a guide. We've compiled a guide with all the results out of this long study. So this is meant to be for interested audience, especially for people from the processing sector, from the packaging sector, from logistics and retailers. For sure, also for consumers, and it is a 40-page guide where we've compiled all the interesting results, and also a lot of details on not only on packaging and life cycle assessment, but also on the consumer surveys, and also on improved processing, which I haven't tackled today. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is a main page out of the guide. We've summarized key findings in 16 points, where we've tried to find pregnant, let's say, paragraphs to conclude and to summarize what we found within these 3 years of studies. Next slide, please. Yeah. To close, to resume, packaging should be avoided. This is often propagated. This is something we could not derive from the results of the study we made, and especially of the LCA and carbon footprint calculations assessments we made. It very much depends on if the omission of packaging generates more food waste because the products are less protected. So if not more food waste is produced, then you can leave away the packaging. But in most of the cases, due to the storage within households, it is important that this food is properly protected, and for that it normally outweighs the disadvantages of higher impacts of the packaging materials, of the improved packaging materials. But as I've said, the choice should depend on the duration until the product is finally consumed. Next slide, please. Yeah, the guide is ready for download. So at first it was available only in German, but now we've translated it as well into English. So you can download it from the EcoPlus homepage, who hosted the project in Austria, and so there are, as I've said, a lot of details and detailed answers on questions you might have. So please feel free to download the guide and have a look at it. So thank you very much, and yeah, I'm looking forward to answering some questions.
Bernd, thank you very much for such a fascinating presentation. For anybody really in retail and packaging environment, the topics that you mentioned are also a point of frustration, because as you said, the consumer perceptions are really very different about the role of packaging and its environmental role. And I think we all feel like the scientific point that you made in your speech today is not really coming across to the wider public, which is actually, again, something that Barry Turner mentioned yesterday. Now, thank you so much for sharing the resources with everybody. And I will jump straight to the questions because we've got quite a few lining up. So the first question is, packaged versus unpackaged, for reference, cucumber case, depends on local food versus transitional. Should retailers support local food systems instead of addressing packaging?
Well, I think these are two different pair of shoes. It very much, let's say, from my experience, it very much depends on the rucksack a food product has. So, for example, depending on if for example the cucumbers or also tomatoes or so on are produced within the region and are transported, they are transported not very fast, so they have not very far, so they have a comparable small rucksack themselves. So compared to they are shipped from far away, having a much higher rucksack, much higher carbon footprint, then you can say that the farther it is transported, the more it is important to have appropriate, proper packaging for these products. So it could be that, for example, if this is locally grown, that almost no packaging at all is, all in all, the best solution in terms of carbon footprint or environmental impact. But the farther it is transported, the higher also the rucksack of the food itself is. So the more it is cheese or meat, then the better the packaging should be to protect the food.
Thank you, Bernd. Now the next question that we have here is, if the paper egg box was lighter than the plastic one, would your conclusion still be that plastic one is better than the paper pulp one?
Well, actually, this is the idea behind these LCA considerations is to look for a functional unit. So not to look comparing different materials on a kilogram basis, but to look on what is necessary to fulfill the function. And in this case, the paper, the carton solution is much heavier than the plastic solution. So the environmental impact of the paper, the carton solution is higher. So if we had a solution where paper is much lighter and it could fulfill the functional unit, and the problem then is if it is lighter, then very likely also the fracture rate of the eggs will be higher, and then you have even more food waste, so which then lasts even in a higher environmental impact. But if you have solutions generally, not only for egg packaging, if you have a plastic packaging and then the paper packaging where the difference in weight is not that bad, then it could definitely be the case that the paper solution performs better. So the advantage of paper compared to plastic is that the environmental impact per kilogram of material is better. On the other hand side, the advantage of plastics is that normally you need far less of material to fulfill a functional unit. And so then at the end, you have to kind of to balance it out, what at the end performs better. So we have results where the plastic solution is the better one, and we have some where the paper solution is the better one.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Bernd. Now, we've got quite a few, so I'll just crack on with the next question. Have you analysed food waste taking into account end of life, is ultimately biomass. Conscious consuming and food composting could be a better solution?
So actually, we have considered also the end of life food waste as well. Yeah, in terms of our considerations, the end of life impact mainly comes from the packaging itself, not from the food waste. As this is biomass, as it is mentioned, the environmental impact in this case is not adverse. Actually, in a lot of cases, we had even a benefit out of end of life treatment. For example, if we have let's say high quality products like meat, so this is not possible. So if it is wasted within the retailers, it's not possible to sell it to people anymore. But then it is converted, for example, to high quality pet food, and then this is there you substitute ordinary pet food, and then you can account this as a benefit. So for that, I would say that I can say yes. The end of life of the food waste itself has not a very high impact. It has a comparably low impact, and in terms of carbon footprinting and LCA, the food composting has let's say also from an LCA perspective, let's say that way, the benefit you can get out of producing another product out of this waste has a higher benefit than composting it.
Thank you, Bernd. And perhaps we've got time for one more question. How significant are these savings compared to other impacts? For example, carbon footprint of journey of food or production of food?
Yeah, actually, the carbon footprint of journey of food is it's very much depending on what food it is. As I've previously mentioned, if you have meat, if you transport meat all over the globe, for example, beef, then the share of the transport is comparably low because the meat itself has a very high carbon footprint. As previously said, beef has more than 20 kilograms CO2 equivalents per kilogram. So if you transport this, it will have a comparably small share of the transport. If you, for example, transport potatoes all around the globe, then it will have a very high impact, the transport, because the potatoes itself, they have a comparable small impact.
Thank you, Bernd. Now, I think we've got just a couple more minutes, I think, and there's so many questions coming. Thank you, everybody, for that. So I'll just read the next one, which is highlighted. What are main differences between consumer perceptions of food packaging and the study findings?
Yeah, well, okay, the consumers, so that the perception of consumers very often is that packaging has a bad reputation. So we found out that more than 90% said that food is overpackaged, and as I've previously said, that about 2/3 of the consumers answered that they think packaging is not helping to avoid food waste, and about half, about 50% or almost 50%, as far as I remember, said that they think that food in original packaging does not help to avoid food waste. So it doesn't matter. It is even better to take it out and put it somewhere else. So this is consumer perception, and this could not be confirmed within our studies. Actually, we found out that not every time, but in the most cases, packaging help to protect food and help to avoid or reduce food waste.
This is so interesting, Bernd, because of course our consumer studies show the same perceptions, that people believe that obviously unwrapping everything is the right environmental thing to do because the plastic debate has been so emotive, but of course we might be just doing more damage. Now, I'm going to break the rules a little bit and just squeeze in one more question before we go. And then I'm going to ask you, Bernd, if you've got a couple of minutes afterwards to maybe answer the remaining questions through a Q&A on Teams, if that's all right. But
Okay,
the one I'm going to conclude on is plastics will always win in weighting in carbon calculators. Show how the LCA of small bits of plastic. Okay, I think this is about small bits of plastic that are being littered. I'm not quite sure. I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure if I understand what this is referring to. I suppose this is about having small products that have tiny pieces of packaging that perhaps are not being recycled. So what is better, maybe those being littered, or
actually yeah. Well, it is right that littering itself, which definitely is a problem we have, is not considered within life cycle assessments that way. So this is there are other impacts considered, like acidification, eutrophication, land use, so on, and of course carbon footprint. Littering is not addressed. A reason why we focus on these typical life cycle assessment impact categories, and also especially on carbon footprint, is that from our point of view, from my point of view, carbon footprint is by far the most important environmental impact, environmental issue. So there are various studies where they had a look at consumer product, also packaging products, and different impacts, and when they compare it by monetarization, then these studies normally, so most of these studies show that carbon footprint has the highest impact. So compared to the others, in terms of we have to to get this under control as the most important thing. For sure, littering is also, like many other impacts, are too high, and it should be fight against this as well. But if you compare, I have in mind a study made by TrueCost. They said that about 50% of the costs, which were the results of 50% of the costs are related to carbon footprint, and I think only about tenth of that, about 5% are to littering or to ocean damage and so on. So this is something which has to be balanced. It has, for sure. You have also to have a look at littering. From my personal point of view, the most important issue is carbon footprint, and this has to be focus has to put on that, and then also behind that to all the other issues. But it has, from my point of view, it does not make sense to, for example, change systems regarding reduction of littering, when at the end of the day you have a significantly or even a higher carbon footprint. So this does not make sense. You have to look for solutions where all these impacts, and especially the carbon footprint, is decreasing.
Bernd, thank you so much. This has been very, very informative, and I have a feeling that we could go for another hour just by asking you all those questions. So thank you for your contribution today. I would really appreciate if you can answer the remaining questions through a Q&A.
Yeah.
And I'll invite everybody for a quick break, and we'll commence again at 12:05 for a presentation from Dr. Sunil Kunamaneni. Thank you.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.
Welcome back, everybody. I've got a great pleasure now to introduce my colleague, Dr. Sunil Kunamaneni, who will speak to you about bioplastics. Now, Sunil Kunamaneni stands at the forefront of sustainability and inclusivity trend. Packaging, agri-food, and social care are just some of the themes that he researches. He has spent the last 10 years supporting social and eco-innovation and entrepreneurship through his various teaching, mentoring, research, and consultancy activities. Sunil drives innovation ecosystems for developing and diffusing ideas and solutions to address pressing socio-environmental problems. A calculated risk taker with deep technical knowledge of materials, Sunil has championed commercialization of eco-materials and technologies with universities, MNC labs, startups, and private technology licensor. He has built a reputation for developing new business strategies and incubating new business models that minimize the impact on the environment. In his current role as an academic at Leeds Business School, Sunil has also fed his insatiable interest in sustainable innovation in emerging countries and inclusive growth. It's my pleasure to hand you over to Dr. Sunil Kunamaneni.
Thanks, Olga. I'm just going to share my presentation now. Okay. Thank you. I hope you can see my presentation now. It's a pleasure to speak at this event. I'm the last speaker, and I hope this would be an interesting talk for you to stay back for. So, as Olga has explained, I'm deeply interested in sustainable materials, particularly from consumption perspective, because the current economic model has changed a lot. We have a consumption-led economic model, and materials are ubiquitous in our consumption-led economy. So bioplastics has been propagated as the alternative for petroplastics. Is that reasonable? Is that viable? Is there a future for bioplastics? That's what I'm going to look at in this talk. I'm going to look at it from a very critical perspective around consumption and whether current state of technology innovation is going to lead to some sort of equilibrium in our consumption. So bioplastics, why the argument for bioplastics? Almost 300 tons of plastics are consumed each year, and they require only about 4% maybe of fossil fuel resources extracted from the earth. But if the current growth in plastics continues, the plastic sector will account for about 20% of total oil consumption by 2050. So growing scarcity and the rising cost of raw materials pose serious concerns around climate change. And this has put the manufacture and production of plastics based on renewable sources back on the center stage. I mean, in the bygone days, we did make things out of plastic. Celluloid was out of biomass. Celluloid was one of the first materials made in the 19th century. But now, we've come back to bioplastics again. And therefore, the critical question, is it a viable alternative or no? And currently, only about 1% of worldwide plastics is actually bioplastics. In pursuing sustainable development and reduction of environmental impact, so bioplastics from renewable biomass, therefore, looks like a logical choice. And though fossil fuels are a natural resource, they are created from dead organisms, the problem of fossil resources are that it takes a million years to create, and we just consume them in a matter of decades, basically. So currently, bio-based plastics, however, are not a universal solution, and you'll see why in my slides. But if we have to move someday, we're going to someday run out of oil. And if we have to move someday either by choice or by necessity, to a world without fossil-based resources, then plastics will have to be made from some other sources, and that most likely source is going to be biomass. This is an interesting article. It's from 1990. It's almost 25 years ago. And the title of the article in New Scientist is Britain's largest chemical company, ICI. Of course, ICI doesn't exist anymore. It's been split into many different parts. Last week announced the launch of the first practical plastic that is totally biodegradable. And it says it took 15 years to develop it. So the development's been going on since the year I was born. I was born in 75. So it's been going on for about, the first ever plastics produced at the end of the 19th century was a bioplastic. It was celluloid. Celluloid was used in the old films, movie films. It's tough, flexible, moldable material. It's resistant to water, oils, acids, and you can produce it at low cost in a variety of colors. Celluloid was made into films, of course, but it was made into toiletry articles, novelties, and many other mass-produced goods. But its popularity began to dwindle by the middle of the 20th century, following the introduction of synthetic plastics made of petroleum. The famous among them was Bakelite. I remember as a kid, all my switchboards were made of Bakelite, smooth, shiny. It was the first ever commercially successful synthetic plastic. Highly valued because it overcame the imperfection of nature with its shiny, smooth qualities, and it simply resisted decay and obsolescence. Basically, celluloid could become could decay, whereas Bakelite resisted obsolescence. So again, there's always this dilemma between obsolescence and something that you want to keep forever, and whether biodegradable plastics can actually meet that durability criteria. But in the 1980s, what was happening was when landfills were running out of space and plastic litter was becoming a problem, bioplastics were first marketed for the degradability characteristics. Many large companies, including ExxonMobil and ICI, developed disposable plastic products in the 80s that were marketed as biodegradable. But of course, Mobil had to ultimately pull back its marketing campaign. Its hefty branded trash bags did not biodegrade entirely in landfills, but simply broke down into smaller bits, basically. So it had to ultimately withdraw. And of course, ICI didn't have those problems, but the demand wasn't there. So again, it had to withdraw because there wasn't demand. This is an interesting quote from the editor of Bioplastics magazine. He says, look, we are at the infancy of bioplastics, but I'm sure that they will survive, and they will not only survive for themselves, but they will survive traditional plastics. I mean, the infant hasn't grown up for 120 years now, basically, so because bioplastics have been there for a long time. And a lot of research has been going on, at least since the early 70s, around biodegradable plastics. But currently, with concerns around climate change and environmentally harmful aspects of plastic waste in our oceans and water bodies, David Attenborough is now on Instagram. He's campaigning about all the problems that we're having with plastics and climate change. So plastics have captured public attention. Petrochemicals, which include plastics, now accounts for 14% of oil use. Still less than what we use in our automobiles, but are rapidly becoming the largest driver of global oil consumption. And according to the IEA, they're set to account for more than a third of the growth in oil demand in 2030. And by 2050, if this continues, nearly half of oil will be used for basic chemicals and plastics. So the World Economic Forum predicts plastic production will double in the next 20 years. So under these conditions, switching the production of chemicals and polymers from oil to biomass and that of energy from fossil fuels to renewables, therefore sounds inevitable, actually. So as such, bio-basedness, and we saw in the case of ICI as well, which is taken from nature, and biodegradability have come to be valued as environmentally friendly attributes. The idea of bio-basedness existed in the 80s. It's not like something new. So bioplastics have the potential to trigger a transition towards more sustainable economies, but such potential really depends on our ability to generate radically new bio-based materials capable of achieving significant environmental benefits, but they should be applicable to more sophisticated applications. And I'll talk about it later, but I think what we are doing is focusing much on incremental innovations using bioplastics. As a critique, this is from Greenpeace. Greenpeace says to solve the plastic pollution crisis, companies need to rethink how products are delivered to consumers and invest significantly in reusable and refillable delivery systems. But the suggestion is great, and it has validity. Bioplastics can increase emissions of greenhouse gases on landfill sites. Some need high temperature to decompose, and others cannot be recycled. So producing bioplastics can use up valuable land resources and can require chemically intensive agriculture, actually. So even if bioplastics were to come from non-food crops, you still need to have industrial scale agriculture. So that will, we are still at the infancy of agri-tech revolution. So agri-tech can hopefully support less use of chemicals in agriculture, but we're still at the infancy of agri-tech. Currently, given the current state of things, if we had to increase the yield of not even non-food biomass, then we'll have to go for chemically intensive agriculture. So they could contribute to the global food crisis as well by taking over large areas of land previously used to grow crops for human consumption. So there's been corn, for example, and sugar crops have been used for drop-in bioplastics. For example, in Brazil, it's sugarcane that's used for biopolyethylene. There's also food crops that are being used for making bioplastics. So consumption perspective on resource use, particularly overuse, should therefore compel producers and retailers to make decisions that would increase resource efficiency through fewer material inputs, durability, and waste prevention. So even bioplastic doesn't look good, so we need to focus on other things, which includes durability, fewer inputs, waste prevention, and also look at overuse actually from the end user perspective as well. So biomass production and processing can therefore have significant impacts, and therefore producing bioplastics responsibly is actually key to realizing its potential. Interesting statement from Tom Zaki. He says, we need durable bioplastics that can be recycled, and they present a more viable opportunity to mitigate our dependence on oil-based plastics. But realistically, offsetting our dependence on petroleum polymer first requires decreasing the overall demand for plastic. And hence, he's created Loop, which offers refillable systems. So the carbon savings of bio-based products are not disputed as much as the excessive consumption of such products. The argument is really not against new technology, but rather that eco-innovations must be supported by policies to address consumer demand and behavior, that is, the need to reduce, reuse, and recycle. And then Tom adds a further statement. He says the only viable alternatives to plastics derived from non-durable sources is durable bioplastics. And he says that durable is key because biodegradable plastics of any composition are not a long-term sustainable solution. Of course, when a biodegradable plastic is composted, the polymer can no longer be reused and maintained, and therefore all the energy that is used in its production is wasted. Of course, the materials go back into nature, but you still require energy to fabricate and manufacture. So all that energy is wasted. So in certain situations, of course, biodegradable plastics may make sense, particularly in countries that have large amounts of organic landfill sites. So currently, it looks like what we're doing in terms of biodegradability, compostability is a short-term solution, but I think we need durable plastics in the long run to reduce our dependence on oil. So this would require that we develop a better understanding of the real problems and solutions for every step of a product's life cycle, from design to reuse and disposable. And I think the end of life, this argument did come up in the previous speaker's talk, and I think the end of life is very important. Often that is what is ignored. Right. So what is happening in the real world? I've done enough of presented enough of critique. So what's happening in the real world? So what are Coke and Pepsi doing? Interesting statements from Coke and Pepsi. Coke says today is a pioneer. This is in 2015. Today is a pioneering milestone within our company's packaging portfolio. Our vision was to maximize game-changing technology using responsibly sourced plant-based materials to create the globe's first fully recyclable PET. Indra Nui, CEO of Pepsi, in 2011 said, they created a 100% bio-PET bottle. Then this is a transformational development for PepsiCo and the beverage industry, and a direct result of a commitment to R&D. What has happened though? The plant bottle is commercially available, but it doesn't have 100% bio-sourced PET. It has 30% bio-based content. PET is basically made of two things. It's made of MEG, monoethylene glycol, and PTA, which is terephthalic acid. So you combine two blocks and make PET. And traditionally, both the building blocks for PET comes from petroleum. However, in plant bottle that Coke created, 30% by weight is biosource. So the MEG, first building block, comes from a biosource. Coca-Cola has sold about 40 million plant bottles between 2009 and 2015. And of course, the PTA in their plant bottle is derived from petroleum. And they did say in 2015 that they were working towards commercializing the next generation of 100% bio-based plant bottle by 2020. Has that happened? No. Though a prototype was launched in 2015, by all accounts, Coca-Cola looked at all the news and I've made my observations. They have not commercialized a completely bio-based bottle. But what have they done instead? Rather, they debuted recently a hybrid bottle. It's called a hybrid bottle for its Dasani mineral water brand. And the hybrid bottle doesn't have 100% bio-based plastic. Instead, it has 50% combination of plant and recycled plastic. So they haven't really met their 100% bioplastic ambition. Allegedly, what happened in 2011 was PepsiCo, to counter Coca-Cola, had announced the world's 100% bio-PET. To some extent, it's a duopoly and it's a game strategy happening here, each signaling to each other the commitment towards R&D. But at the time, Pepsi could only make lab samples. It wasn't commercial. And it said it intended to have a pilot production of 100% bio-PET. The same year, a decade later, there is still no suggestion of 100% bio-PET that is commercially available, or else PepsiCo would not have joined the Nature All Alliance. The Nature All Alliance was launched between Nestle, Danone, and Origin Materials, that's based in California, in 2017, to produce a PET bottle with 75% bio-based content. And of course, the idea was to gradually go up to 95% in 2020, and then later on 100%. So they joined the Natural Alliance. They never commercialized their own bio-PET. Apparently, perhaps it was too expensive to produce it. And on another note, differently, Coca-Cola joined the tobacco community to produce a recyclable and biodegradable paper bottle. So tobacco is led by Alpla, which is a packaging company, and Billerud Korsnäs, I can't pronounce it properly, sorry. It's a paper and pulp company based in Scandinavia. And the other brand members include Carlsberg, L'Oreal, and Coca-Cola. And one of the layer technologies, the barrier technologies provided by a company called as Aventium, and I'll discuss about what Aventium is doing a bit later. But yeah, there's clearly no winner between Coke and Pepsi. I mean, a world where we can be assured that all beverage containers are 100% reusable, biodegradable, or compostable is not on the near horizon at the minute. As long as we keep plasticizing fossil fuels or organic materials like corn. And what does the efforts by Pepsi and Coca-Cola show? It shows that humans trust in an optimum future. They trust technology, and they trust organizations that created the problems with plastic waste in the first place. Consumers may believe that all this unsustainable growth driven by consumption would somehow stop by itself through consuming alternatives such as biodegradable materials. And interesting, the circular economy concept proposes, in the first talk there was mention of circular economy. Circular economy concept proposes closing material loops to preserve products, parts, and materials in the industrial systems and extract maximum utility out of them. So what does this make us believe? This makes us believe that eventually growth will outgrow itself. And we may reach some equilibrium when consumption is constant and regenerative. That's the whole idea behind biodegradable materials, that things will become regenerative. But advances in biodegradable materials tend to require or contribute more to consumption. So let's take the disposable cutlery market. It is seeing a growth because of changing lifestyles and increase in online food delivery. So compostable and biodegradable disposable cutlery is actually seeing the fastest growth despite higher environmental impacts compared to traditional plastic cutlery. And much of the so-called progress is, however, incremental, actually, local or temporary, and it is unable on a global scale to produce enough change to mitigate the damaging environmental consequences of overuse, of buying and using most consumer products. And although bioplastics appear attractive today, they do not provide straightforward global solutions that will allow human consumption patterns to remain unchecked. So a good example again is seaweed as a source of bioplastics. Seaweed production is still 0.3% of global agricultural output. Seaweed packaging could grow, that's the speculation, to become a worldwide source for small-scale packaging solutions. And in terms of large-scale products, seaweed may not work due to costs, labor concerns, and durability. Moreover, although plastics are essential requirements of modern supply chains and will remain so, especially within the context of increasing urbanization and try and buy everything online these days, everything comes in packaging, food production will always remain a priority. There are lots of, we cannot advance bioplastics at the expense of poorer developing countries who still rely on agriculture and who struggle to feed their population. So seaweed is a very nutritious product, and seaweed should be used in food production rather than in packaging, and that's the argument. So what about other materials? There's been a lot of talk about this new material called as PEF, which is polyethylene furanoate. PEF is 100% recyclable, 100% bio-based polymer produced using renewable raw materials derived from plants. And it is referred to as the next generation polyester, which exhibits great potential to replace PET. And as compared to PET, PEF has numerous benefits: superior barrier performance, thermal properties, and it's easily processable, low melting temperature basically. And it offers a long shelf life for content. Its oxygen barrier is 10 times that of PET. Its carbon dioxide barrier is 4 times that of PET. So there's a lot of interesting functionalities that PEF has. And the company that is actually pushing PEF is Avantium. And you might recognize from the logo who might be the origin of Avantium. It's actually a spin-off from Shell. You know, the colors in the logo look very similar to Shell. So Avantium, of course, Shell doesn't own it anymore, but in 2000 it spun it out and Shell was good at high throughput chemistry, and Avantium was initially spun off to work on high throughput chemistry, but later on it started commercializing technologies to make PEF. Okay, so its most advanced technology, PEF has 2 ingredients basically. One is furanic, it's called FDCA, and according to the US Department of Energy report, it was one of the 12 high potential bio-based chemicals that could revolutionize the future of our bioeconomy. So PEF has 2 components, FDCA and MEG, and FDCA is one of the 12 promising chemicals according to the Department of Energy. And Avantium also recently formed a consortium in Europe called as Peference to drive commercialization of PEF. It's still at very early stages, though. It hasn't, a large-scale commercial plant hasn't still been built. And the consortium includes Lego, Henkel, Alpla, and Nestle. And the consortium actually secured a 25 million funding under Horizon grant. And the funding aims to support the establishment of an innovative value chain for PEF. And ultimately, if you want to commercialize PEF, you have to show that it fits into the supply chain, and that's what companies like Nestle and Coca-Cola would be looking at. But you know, and what is but what is its current status? I mean, the number of patents is growing up as I've shown in the slide since 2008. There's been an exponential rise in the number of patenting activity. But when it comes to products and commercialization, a prototype exists for the paper bottle. You know, and Avantium has supplied the technology to form a barrier layer within the bottle. But according to, and that's for Carlsberg, but according to Carlsberg, the bottles will not be sold soon. We are working on a product that is viable and that is also suitable for the consumer market in terms of price. And they say it is too early to say when we will come to that position. So it's still, there's a lot of uncertainty around PEF. I'm going to, in view of time, I think I'll come back to the commercialization challenges in the question and answer session, but I'm going to quit one of the slides and go on to the other promising material, which is PBS. And it's the same story with PBS. You know, PBS has been, again, it's a very promising material. It has properties similar to polyethylene. And in the 2004 US DOE report, one of the building blocks for PBS, which is succinic acid, was called a magic chemical, you know, a chemical with a lot of promise. But what has happened to the producers of succinic acid? So there are 4 companies that jump-started: Miriant, BioAmber, Reverdia, and Succinity. BioAmber bankrupt. Miriant sold its facilities and assets to PTT global company, because PTT makes the end product PBS. You know, succinic acid goes into making PBS, but that plant has been idle for the last 18 months. Succinity, this was a BASF and Corbion venture. I tried to see if Succinity exists. The link on BASF's site doesn't work, so Succinity's website doesn't work basically. So there's been no news about Succinity for years. What about Reverdia? So Reverdia was a DSM initiative with Rocket, and DSM has pulled out of the venture in 2019. It's given all its IP and assets to Rocket, and it needs to be seen what is going to happen with Rocket's plant in Italy. Okay, so the other two materials that hold, I'm conscious that we've run out of time, but I think the message I want to give, though, is that there are other materials like nanocellulose. They have a lot of promise, but again, nanocellulose is a very strong material, but on its own, it's very hygroscopic. It loves water, so there are lots of challenges in actually making the product and making it into durable plastics as well. There's a lot of challenge there. And the efforts seem to be around cutlery and water bottles and stand-up pouches, and which I regard as incremental innovations, and whereas we should be focusing on more durable applications. And PHAs is the other one, and PHAs are interesting. They're not really, they can't become a universal solution to all plastics, but they have some sort of a potential because PHAs are tunable. You know, you can tune the properties to suit any application and any need. Looking at the patent analysis, what has happened is the technology seems to have matured. So if you look at the blue curve, that's all about the macromolecular chemistry, and the technology has matured, and the orange curve is actually the total patents, and a lot of these patents around applications of PHAs. So it seems to be growing, PHAs. And there's a lot of interest certainly in PHAs, but there is a challenge. You know, this is my last statement. In the cost of extraction and purification of the polymer, it requires solvents. They're harmful to the nature, and therefore, if PHAs were to become truly eco-friendly, more fundamental research is really needed. And I think we need to go back to the blue curve and do more fundamental research, basically. Okay, and yeah, so my final thoughts are, it's an uncertain world for bio-based plastics. In fact, there are more questions. Can bio-based plastics really disrupt the sector? Or will it be business as usual, where everything comes still from petrochemical sources, and whether synthetic biology can support promising plastics like PHAs?
Sunil, thank you so much for a great presentation. I really enjoyed the case studies that you've shared of businesses already utilizing some of the biopolymer materials. And I suppose in the current climate, we will see more of those, I hope. Now, I would like to go forward towards the questions, because we've got a few already lining up. If I could have the screen, perhaps. Wonderful, thank you. So the first question for you, Sunil, is cost of bioplastics the main challenge when looking at adapting it as a packaging material?
Yes, I would say yes. I mean, advanced radical materials that are being promised, like PHAs, involves commercializing new knowledge that is generated by basic and applied research. And that's why I think for things like PHAs and PEF, we've got all these consortiums that also involve universities and labs and even R&D labs of large companies. So the novelty of the technology actually leads to a high level of uncertainty, of course, but commercialization of these radical materials requires expensive process innovation, prototype development, pilot plant development, which greatly exceed the mandate and budgets of research universities. You know, once they've all, I guess they've all hit this valley of death stage, and they need a lot more funding to make it viable at the minute. And additionally, the radical nature of technology may initially require a technology push commercialization. You know, that's what companies did with things like Kevlar fiber, because many consumers in the potential markets do not perceive utility ex ante. So yes, the cost is high, but because the demand isn't there, someone has to take the risk and create the demand and reduce the cost, basically.
Yeah.
So in a sense, yeah, it is expensive.
So we're waiting for that first innovator to kind of prepare the road for everybody else.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you. Now, the next question is, should I not buy disposable biodegradable cutlery?
That's a very good question. I mean, as I've said before, the compostable plastics, I think the LCA does say for biodegradable cutlery at least that the impact is more than the normal cutlery if it's recycled. And again, the thing is, the normal cutlery made out of petroplastics has to be recycled. But if that's the case, then the disposable biodegradable cutlery do have a larger environmental impact. And interesting. This is an interesting thing. I went to actually check out a few supermarkets 2 weeks ago, hunting for biodegradable cutlery, and a lot of them are made from bagasse. Bagasse is by no means grown in the UK. It comes from developing countries. So again, this is the statement I want to make: is are we consuming these things just to look good, and are we putting a burden on developing countries? Do we really know how the supply chain actually functions? So those are the questions that really need to be answered, and I don't think we have any good ideas about the supply chain at the minute. But there are companies which, for example, there's a company in the US which is producing cutlery using fallen leaves in the autumn season. So if and I think that's a viable opportunity to pursue. So if consumers don't just go for the bio label, but really understand what the supply chain is, how the material is made, then the shopping experience would be considered a conscious shopping experience.
That's such a good point, Sunil, and I think it brings us back to Audra's presentation as well about this global social responsibility and the big, especially pressure on the brands and on the retailers to really understand where the products are coming from, and that is not a knowledge sometimes that's easily accessible, I suppose. So therefore, your knowledge is really supporting that kind of decision making for them. Now, I'll go to the next question. What is the most market-ready bioplastic material for food packaging?
Well, it's PLA, isn't it, at the minute? That's what everyone's working on. But I think that's why I kind of really not talked about PLA in my talk today, because I wanted to focus on what's coming up, because PLA, I'm digressing from the actual question, but the reason I didn't speak about PLA is because PLA cannot offer a universal solution at the minute, and I was quite interested in what is happening in terms of new materials development. PHA is an interesting one. BioOn, which is an Italian company, has launched an initiative called a Zero Pack, and they are making at the minute, I think, prototypes for food packaging applications, and hopefully it should be hopefully these products should be in the market very soon.
Also, as Sunil, I understand that PLA is not a very liked material by retailers. Is there a reason for that?
It needs industrial composting. It's not really home compostable.
For which we don't have the infrastructure.
Yeah. So whereas PHAs can be home composted, and therefore BioOn has launched the Zero Pack initiative to make products out of PHA. Check out what the demand is. Again, it's a technology push, and I didn't refer to that slide, but there are two things you need to cut. There's the technology uncertainty and there's the market uncertainty. It's a chicken and egg situation, really. And the technology cannot develop further if at least there is no initial hint from the market that there is a demand for that. So therefore, some companies like BioOn, which are very research intensive, have launched these initiatives to actually cut that market uncertainty at the same time as solving technology uncertainty. When I was talking about PHAs, I was saying, look, the cost of extraction and purification is still high. The yields are very low. there'll be more waste produced because there'll be uncontrolled bacterial growth, which will eat up all your carbohydrates, and polymer production will be less. So that needs to be controlled. So the yields are low. So while working on tech uncertainty, you also need to tackle the market uncertainty. And when you tackle both uncertainties, you have a success.
Excellent. Thank you, Sunil. Now I've got the last question from you for you from the audience. What are your suggestions to overcome or bypass incremental environmental innovations?
It's very simple, I think. It's a very simple thing. So I think companies and governments as well, they look at litter. Okay, they look at ocean and they look at all the plastic bags. And I was other day I was in South Downs and I went to the beach. Warm weekend. Last weekend was quite warm, and I saw plastic bags on the seashore, and I picked them up. And little children, I was with my friends' children, and they were quite inspired by that. So it was really good to see. But all this throwaway is because of consumption. And I think the governments should focus on solving this consumption problem, but spend more time on basic research. A lot of the time, state-led innovation is important, to make these changes. Ocean plastics is an issue. It's not going to be solved, in my opinion, by corporate. A lot of the big technologies have come by state-led innovation. So state-led innovation to support radical research, transforming our economy from a petrol-based economy to a completely bio-based economy is a huge challenge and requires a lot of radical innovations, basic fundamental research, and that needs to happen in universities. So rather than looking for short-term solutions for cutlery and plastic bags, making them compostable, I think we should look at more radical research, as Tom Zaki was saying, more durable plastics in the future, and that requires a lot of basic research, but it has to be done by state-led innovation.
Yes, and it's, as you say, it's really a systemic change we're looking at, which is why this is so challenging. I suppose one of the, when we talk about reusable products or refillable products that we can take and refill at in supermarkets, let's say, I suppose we've been testing the ground for some years now, but we really need that mass scale action of some sort to really adapt to a new way of living. And I suppose we all fear the fact that we're not just quick enough to be able to make those climate change, meet those climate change objectives by 2050. It doesn't seem to be quick enough. But do you think that COVID has moved some of those environmental conversations?
I'm not sure. We're seeing an increase in disposable masks now.
Yes, there's littering from those. Yeah.
Again, there are innovations, and some of my students are working on some entrepreneurial projects. There's a company called Sterimelt, I think, which recycles hospital waste and extracts the polypropylene out of them. So yes, it is a growing. I think hospital waste is going to grow in post-COVID, and we need more companies like Sterimelt to actually support the closed loop economy to recover materials. Otherwise, I was seeing a documentary the other day, Anita Rani, I think, I can't remember whose documentary it was. The turtles were covered with masks, surgical masks. That is really bad. Is COVID helping? No, certainly not. It looked peaceful and the air was free of pollution in the beginning, but I think everyone's back on the road now. And there's more consumption. Consumption is back. So I'm not sure if COVID's helped.
Right. Well, on this note, we'll conclude the presentation for today. Thank you, Sunil, so much. It was very insightful, very informative presentation from you on bioplastics and on some of those solutions we should be really looking and embracing in the future. So thank you for your contribution. If there's any other questions, please direct them to us and we'll pass them on to Sunil or other speakers. Now we have come to the end of the program for this week, for the annual briefing that took place online. We have had a range of talks on a number of topics, most of them focusing on different aspects of sustainability and managing challenges that COVID-19 has presented us with. We heard from companies like IKEA, Tetra Pak, Coca-Cola, BASF, and Worldwide Generation. We had contributions from Scottish Environmental Agency, Ecosurety, and British Plastics Federation organisations, with some strategic views on plastic and on how we can move forward closer to circular economy. We also, to ensure that we can share some academic knowledge, we shared the expertise of Dr. Esther Pugh, Dr. Audra Diaz-Lawson, Dr. Sunil Kunamaneni, and Dr. Bernd Brandt. Now, we hope that you really enjoyed this program and that you liked the format. We will be circulating a link next week to ask you for your feedback on the sessions and for any comments on improvements. Now, we would like to thank you again for being such a great audience and being so engaged and in so many numbers coming onto those sessions. And we would like to also wish you a good and restful weekend. Thank you very much, and we'll see you at the next Retail Institute event.